Before we go to the next motion, we have a request for introduction of invited guests in the gallery. Do we have consensus? Agreed. Recognize the member for Southwest Miramichi-Béduvant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are three friends of mine here today in the legislature. I'd like each of you to rise individually. Number one, we have Ben Benedict. He's the president of my riding association. Good man. He just wrote a new book on history in Blackville and Renews and surrounding regions, surrounding Miramichi. He's been a good friend of mine. He's here today. We don't get him here too often. He doesn't like to stand up, as you can see, but he's written a good book, and I just wanted to welcome him. Next, Councillor Christopher Hennessy of Blackville. His dad was a great friend to my father. Chris is the president of Miramichi Snowgoers Club 22, councillor in Blackville, and was hoping that the blogger would interview him here today, but we couldn't set that part up. The third one, Mr. Speaker, is my father, Daniel Stewart. I call him Dad usually, but it's Daniel R. Stewart, and we were never in politics in our house, Mr. Speaker. We never talked about it too much. Dad would be a big proponent for hook and cook rather than hook and release. He and many of us in Miramichi like to eat a few salmon, and we don't like to be bothered about that, but there's some of us here that could agree. But thank you, all three of you, for being here today, and welcome to the People's House, and enjoy your stay.
Deviating motion 6, recognize again the member for Southwest Miramichi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move, seconded by the member from Fredericton Grand Lake, to propose the following resolution on Thursday, December 10, 2015. Whereas New Brunswick is Canada's only officially bilingual province, whereas access to second language training is limited or non-existent in many communities across the province, which impedes mutual understanding and access to opportunities, whereas access to French immersion education programming is limited or non-existent in many schools across the province, whereas the government's ability to continue to provide a high quality of services to citizens in both official languages may be affected by a lack of investment in second language training and education, whereas there are best practices in other jurisdictions as well as new technology which could be explored to address the gap in investment in second language training and education. Be it therefore resolved that this Assembly urge the government to examine the issue of second language education and training and report back to this Assembly with a plan to enhance opportunities for New Brunswickers to improve their skills in communicating in both official languages.
It has been moved by the member for Southwest Miramichi-Béduvant, seconded by the member for Fredericton Grand Lake. Whereas New Brunswick is Canada's only official bilingual province, whereas access to second language training is limited or non-existent in many communities across the province, which impedes mutual understanding and access to opportunity. Whereas access to French immersion education programming is limited or non-existent in many schools across the province, whereas the government's ability to continue to provide a high quality of service to citizens in both official language may be affected by a lack of investment in second language training and education. Whereas there are best practices in other jurisdictions as well as new technology which could be explored to address the gap in investment in second language training and education. Be it therefore resolved that this Assembly urge the government to examine the issue of second language education and training and report back to this Assembly with a plan to enhance opportunities for New Brunswick to improve their skill in communicating in both official language. Recognize the member for Southwest Miramichi Baie-du-Vent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today's motion is a debate that I feel that is necessary in New Brunswick, and I think it can be free of attacks and personal attacks, and I don't see it as a partisan motion in any way. I see it as just something that New Brunswickers probably want to talk about, especially in rural New Brunswick and in the parts of New Brunswick that I represent. Mr. Speaker, the year was 1969. Louis Robichaud was our premier. He noticed a need for an equal opportunity, and there were French-speaking people in New Brunswick are a distinct minority in our province. He saw a need where they could get services in their own language. I think that was a noble thing that he sought out at the time, and I know that Hatfield's government came in and made some implementations of what he was suggesting. And I think if you look at it, the Act making New Brunswick Canada's only officially bilingual province was introduced in '69. Think about that, Mr. Speaker. In 3 years, it is the semi-centennial. The intent was never to make every citizen of our province bilingual through education, legislation, or any other means. I believe it was about rights, respect, and opportunity. Exactly what I'm seeking for rural people with this motion. And I want to make it very clear that it's true that places like Chipman, Minto, Doketown, Stanley, Sunny Corner, Blackville, Millerton, and many other communities that are close, near to my constituency boundaries, they don't offer French immersion. So, not having French immersion, which would be the highest level of language training we have in our school system, not having that really doesn't enable citizens where I live to actually become bilingual, unless, of course, they travel on a school bus for 2 hours a day, while it stops all along the way between Blackville and Chatham, or Doketown and Fredericton, which would be even longer. So I think there's a real gap in investment, and something has been clearly missed since 1969. Because when you read the Official Languages Act, and you read the many pieces of legislation that we've added to this as part of our history, you see words like equal opportunity, words like harmony, words such as promotion and promoting languages. Mr. Speaker, it strikes me that this motion and this very debate may just in fact be over 45 years late in coming. It's 2016, and I don't believe there's anything groundbreaking here, but I believe it should have occurred 45 years ago. And that, to me, is the part where a member of the Legislative Assembly must stand on their own 2 feet, get support from caucus, which has happened here, and really debate an issue that doesn't have to be taboo, doesn't have to be deadly and negative and something where people could be really, uncomfortable in talking about it. I think that we have 2 official languages, French and English, and I think that the province of New Brunswick has never actually focused on our citizens learning both of those languages. And I think, Mr. Speaker, if you look at equal opportunity, it cannot be dismissed as too expensive. Basic rights cannot really have a dollar figure attached to them. And I think Canadians and New Brunswickers and all people would agree with that. The Equal Opportunities Program was introduced, as we know, in the 1960s, yet we are still able to identify areas that are still lacking in our province. In today's case, rural education. And I want to make something very clear. I would have included English immersion in this motion. And if there is a member in this House that can tell me that such a thing exists, I will support any amendment to this motion, because in the research I did on my own accord, I couldn't find that it actually existed, although it might. I looked a little bit and it didn't seem like it was there. In our systems today, Mr. Speaker, we have ESL and FSL, English as a second language teacher, and French as a second language. My wife teaches English as a second language. And I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, I want to go back and I want to talk a little bit about the 70s and 80s. In the 1970s and 1980s, it was considered impractical for rural people, rural English people, to learn French where they might not really need to use it. And it was probably seen as just as impractical for people in, say, on the peninsula, like Carrickett or Lamech, just to name a few. It was probably impractical for them to learn English as well. So, Mr. Speaker, back then, it was considered bricks and mortar, extra staff, millions of dollars worth of new books, and building new pieces of infrastructure just to house all of this additional education, be it through language. So it never happened. And in the 1970s and 1980s, becoming bilingual was probably considered a great asset if you had it, but it certainly wasn't a goal of the province. There's no legislation that binds the province of New Brunswick to produce bilingual citizens. We don't have that. So whether or not in 1969, it was about two distinct groups having equal rights. Who couldn't support it? I support it. I think official bilingualism has made us unique in many ways. But I think we missed something. And I think we missed it starting in around the early to mid-1990s. And that's where I want to go. So I've told you in the 70s and 80s, Mr. Speaker, it was considered extra funding. It was considered impractical and something the government and the taxpayers of New Brunswick just simply couldn't afford. I'm sure that is an adequate argument for the day. In 1995, I was in grade 12. I was vice president of the student council in Blackville School, and guys across the floor, please don't laugh at me, but I was king at the pageant. Now, I should never be telling you this because you'll use it against me, but you know, Mr. Speaker, the reason I'm telling you this is I was crowned king at a pageant for a local school, but my question by the judges was on the referendum in Quebec. And all of my questioning that night was on the referendum and the sovereignty sought out by some people in the province of Quebec, and a very serious issue in Canadian history. So the interesting part was, after the pageant and all of that, I remember sitting in my school and saying, I wonder why we don't have French immersion, because I'd like to become bilingual. I would like that. You know, I consider myself a fairly worldly person. I've done a fair bit of traveling since then. Spent time in Italy, Korea, Japan, Thailand. I actually spoke more Korean and Italian than I did in French. And that's very sad for the province of New Brunswick. And I guess when you're immersed in something, you're going to do a better job at it. But Mr. Speaker, in 1995, the principal at the time, a friend of mine, he told me it was the impracticalities of the 1970s and 1980s. Later that year, we became part of the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, the fact that we actually had become officially bilingual so many years earlier. So, Mr. Speaker, it is my opinion that in the mid-1990s, or a little before that, being bilingual, there started to be a shift in the province of New Brunswick. And this is my opinion, and I'm sharing it here because I think this is a debate that is worthy, non-partisan and not negative, but just something we should discuss. I see it as a discussion. In the early to mid-1990s, with the referendum and with the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, some additional changes to official bilingualism, it seems that being bilingual in terms of seeking employment had become more than just an asset. It seems like it started the process of actually becoming a requirement. And although I can't prove this fully, and I can't back it up with, some sort of deep, profound educational proof, but many New Brunswickers are telling things like this to all of us MLAs. We're probably all hearing something about it. And I think when the economy's down and the province is in bad shape and global markets are down, governments are making poor policies, all of the like, people start to weigh in on jobs and the likelihood of getting one. Every citizen has a right to look for work. Every citizen does have a right to work if they want to find a job. Nobody has the right or the entitlement to a public or government, position. But when you've got sections of the province who are not learning the other language, they are placed at a disadvantage. I'm not blaming the Progressive Conservatives for this, or the Liberal Party. I'm blaming the government as a whole, and I think we've gone to a place, a very dangerous place, where we may have placed a requirement on being bilingual as opposed to an asset. Now, in a perfect world, where the government of New Brunswick educated its children and its adults with French immersion and English immersion or a similar equivalent to that, I wouldn't have any problem with that. I think becoming bilingual, learning to communicate in another language, that really is an asset. It's an asset when you travel. It's an asset to work abroad. Communication is knowledge. Knowledge can be power, influence. There can be a great asset in learning another language. So for me, Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned because rural New Brunswick needs French immersion. And if French immersion is not working, which I often hear, change that. I can't give you the most honest account of how that must change. But if it needs to be changed, change it and put it in the schools, and I'm going to tell you how you can do that. In the 70s and 80s, it was considered impractical, costly, too expensive, waste of money, waste of taxpayers' dollars. If, in fact, we've moved the ability to get a job to having a requirement of being bilingual rather than just an asset, if we're talking about making bilingual radiologists who never meet the public, they read our x-rays and then our family doctor calls you, bilingual paramedics, bilingual nurses, we might be going too far. And the big point about this whole debate is we haven't educated our children. And I don't think there's anybody in this legislature that can openly disagree with that. Because the way it is, Mr. Speaker, we have to make a decision in New Brunswick. We market ourselves to the world as being bilingual. We sell it as unique. We market it through the tourism department, and I agree with it. But the kids aren't learning it. And Mr. Speaker, there can be no greater way to promote somebody's language than to learn it. Can anybody tell me a better way to promote, a better way to learn another person's culture? How can we do it without educating our children? How can we do it when NBCC has axed second language training in the colleges? Mr. Speaker, second language training in Miramichi never came with the additional skills development funding. So many people will be on unemployment and employment insurance in rural New Brunswick. We know this. We have a poor economy. A lot of our mills are gone. It's not uncommon for people to be on EI in rural New Brunswick. They go to skills development, they apply to get jobs. The second language training in Miramichi, which of course is French language, because majority of people in that area are English, they never attach the additional funding to it. So by admission, Crown Corporation, New Brunswick Community Colleges, basically is saying that having a second language is not a career-building move. I will argue with that. I will argue with that, and there's not a minister in this House, past or present, that won't look me in the eye and say I'm onto something. Our colleges never provided the additional funding, which meant that it was more expensive and not seen as a career builder. Mr. Speaker, as the only official bilingual province in Canadian history, in order to make it work, we have to look at those gaps. Employment should be shared by English, French, First Nations people, and anybody else who's living in our province. But if we're going to base their getting a job on how many languages they speak, what are we saying to the demographics? And these are French people and English people. What are we saying to these rural demographics that are not learning the other language? I'm sure that 40 years ago, some parents said, well, it's not important, we don't need to learn that. And you know what? Back then, it probably wasn't too important, but it is today. And as a lawmaker in this province, I can't sit here and not acknowledge that to be the truth. I believe it is so. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have?
5 more minutes.
5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, in looking at all of this, I'm trying to encourage a discussion that I think is long overdue. I mean no ill will by it or harm. I actually think it should be a welcoming thing to the taxpayers of this province who do care about education. So my being here today is for the government of New Brunswick to know that I feel, and we feel on this side of the floor, and many people in New Brunswick feel, that if we're truly bilingual, and if we can place such a high precedent on employment standards, we must educate our children, and we must give our adults second language training. I believe it has nothing at all to do with party politics. There's no partisanship in this at all. For me, I represent Bay St. Anne, Doketown, Boys Town, two very distinctly different communities in New Brunswick, and my riding is almost 3 hours long. I have French communities and English, and I used to represent Mattapanagea. And so I've sort of seen many different cultures that we have here in New Brunswick. And Mr. Speaker, I would really like to talk about something else. In South Korea, 2004, I was hospitalized. I was hospitalized for 9 days. The Korean people thought I had tuberculosis. I took some sort of allergic reaction to some sort of pollen that blows in from China. And I wanted to say something because a lot of paramedics are really upset lately, and I'm hearing about it. You know, it's part of my constituency. It's my duty to speak to their interests and what they're telling me. While laying in a Korean hospital for 8 to 9 days, nobody could speak English to me. Every day they brought me in 15 pills, all different colors. I'll never know what those pills were, but I took them. I took them each every day because I was in a lot of pain. Now, my doctor could speak English, but I only seen him like once a day for 10 minutes, and now he visits us in Miramichi. But I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, that we must be careful in New Brunswick to not we must not overlook merit and experience and competence when we're looking at the highly skilled jobs, all frontline services, commissioners, some administrative staffs in some of the big public buildings. Everybody knows they should be speaking 2 languages. That was the reason, that was, I think, what Louis Robichaud intended. But I think we've got really far from what he intended. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say that I'm asking the government to examine the gap and look at education. And lastly, we have smart boards. We have telecollaboration methods. We have Skype. We have video conferencing. We have the internet. We have high levels of high fiber and broadband. We have the ability for kids in Doketown to Skype in with kids in Caracat and learn French together and learn English together. And why? Because we have the internet. We have the same time zone. We already have the FSL teacher and the ESL teacher. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to say, oh, this is 20 million. It's not 20 million. You've already got the internet. You've already got the staff. You've already got the teachers. You've got the smart boards. You've got everything you need to start looking at how to better educate the children of this province. And there's no greater benefit than them staying here or leaving here and speaking 2 languages. Look at Sweden, Finland, Switzerland. They learn 5 languages. They don't have the time in their day to argue over 2 of them. They don't have that time. But if we're going to be officially bilingual, I think we need to look at this. So I'm suggesting this today, and I thank the government for listening in, and almost all of them are over there, and I'm happy about that, and I just want you to look at that. I want you to examine it. I'm asking the Education Minister and your colleagues and the Premier, take a look at those gaps, and if I can be any assistance to you, I will. And when you bring it in, I will vote for it and support it. Thank you.